Welcome to AskFOI, where we answer the most common questions we receive here at the Friends of Israel on prophecy, Israel, and the Bible. Today with me is Chris Katulka. Welcome back, Chris.
It's great to be here. Thanks, Steve.
In Deuteronomy 34, the Israelites are about to go into the Promised Land, and God takes Moses on top of Mount Nebo. This is in modern day Jordan, and he lets him see the Promised Land. In verse 4, he says to Moses, "This is the land of which I swore to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants. I have caused you to see it with your eyes, but you shall not cross over there." Why wasn't Moses, this huge figure in the Old Testament, not allowed to go into the Promised Land?
Yeah, when you read the end of Deuteronomy, it almost seems like God is torturing Moses. He brings him right up to the border after leading the Israelites for 40 years through the wilderness, and he brings them right up to the promised land. So it's the culmination of basically Exodus to the end of Deuteronomy. It's the culmination of this moment, and then God says, "Hey, you know what? You're not going in." And there's a reason for that because you actually have to go back to the book before Deuteronomy, to Numbers chapter 20. It's called The Waters from the Rock, or from Meribah, from the Rock of Meribah, where the Israelites are journeying through the wilderness, and they are thirsty. And in verse 2 of Numbers chapter 20, it says, "Now there was no water for the community, and the people gathered in opposition to Moses and Aaron, and they quarreled with Moses." And so eventually, you see that quarreling again. That's common with the Israelites as they're moving through the wilderness. And so they're quarreling, and now Moses is beginning to get frustrated because this has become a repetition for the Israelites. The Israelites have been known for quarreling now, and complaining to Moses. And so Moses gets instructions from the Lord. In verse 6, it says, "Moses and Aaron went from the assembly to the entrance to the tent of meeting and fell face down. And the glory of the Lord appeared to them. And the Lord said to Moses, 'Take this staff, and you and your brother Aaron gather the assembly together. Speak to that rock before their eyes, and it will pour out its water, and you will bring water out of the rock for the community so they and their livestock can drink.'" And so God provides the water for the thirsty Israelites and for their livestock. And all Moses had to do was go, and if you remember, all he had to do was go to that rock and speak to it. But what ends up happening starts in verse 9. "So Moses took the staff from the Lord's presence, just as he had commanded him, and he and Aaron gathered the assembly together in front of the rock. And Moses said to them, 'Listen, you rebels, must we bring you water out of this rock?' Then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock twice with his staff. Water gushed out, and the community and their livestock drank." So they got their water, okay? No one's complaining after that. They drank. "But then the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, 'Because you did not trust in me enough to honor me as holy in the sight of the Israelites, you will not bring this community into the land that I am giving them.'" So what's going on here is something interesting, because when you go through the Ten Commandments, there's a commandment that you will not take the Lord's name in vain. Oftentimes, when we think about that phrase, taking the Lord's name in vain, we think about just saying God's name at a particular, maybe in a sentence or something like that, when we shouldn't, okay? But it's more than that. To use the Lord's name in vain is the idea that you're basically taking the holiness of God and you're trampling over it. You're using it to your own advantage. You're abusing the name of God for your own advantage in many ways. And so this is exactly what Moses did here. God gave Moses very gentle instructions to speak to the rock, and the rock would bring forth water. That's God's command. But instead, when Moses stood up in front of the Israelites, he was representing God's name in that moment. And instead of representing God's name and God's grace and compassion in that moment and providing these Israelites who are thirsty with some water, instead, the vision that they got of God is an angry, frustrated God as he's banging that rock and doing the complete opposite, because Moses was a representative of God's name in that moment, and he did the opposite of what God asked. And so when you're looking through Numbers, it's very interesting. The reason why Moses was not allowed to go into the promised land, he could usher them right up to the border of it. But the reason why was because he abused, or he took advantage of God's holiness by standing there and doing the opposite of what God had asked him to do, because it was God's name that was connected to those commands. God commanded him, it says. Moses and Aaron, that's when they went to the tent of meeting. God said to Moses, do it this way. And Moses did it his own way, but using God's name connected to it. And that's when God said, you're not going on. You're not going to work. You're not going to make your way into the land. And so God does bring Moses. God brings Moses up to that moment where he's able to see all of the land. Actually, that passage in Deuteronomy 34 gives the picture that Moses sees everything. But it's really an interesting thing that right there Moses has to stop. But that's because of what he did back at Numbers chapter 20.
That's great insight because on the surface, so often I think it's easy just to see it as harsh. God's just not being forgiving or gentle with Moses. That, wow, he makes one mistake and now he can't go into the promised land. So it can seem harsh, but with that insight, I think we understand that it was really an issue of Moses' heart and how he was representing God. So, what do we take away from that as representatives of Christ? How do we take that as ministry leaders? What is the universal principle that we can learn from this incident with Moses?
I talk about this passage a lot as a representative of Friends of Israel, but God tells us what his character and nature is, routed back to Exodus chapter 34. And as representatives as ambassadors of Christ, we should have the character and nature of God, which is a compassionate, merciful, loving, forgiving God. And that's exactly the way that even God, in the midst of their quarreling, Moses, God says, just go speak to the rock and I'm going to provide for my people. But Moses took advantage of that and showed an opposite side of almost what an angry God would look like. So really, I think for us, we should be able to look at this and say, if we're going to represent God, we have to represent what his character and nature are. And doesn't mean that we're not going to tell the truth, because God is a truth-telling God. He does not lie, but it also means that we do it in a way that is compassionate and kind and merciful and forgiving as well. That is the character and nature of God. Can I add one more thing too?
Absolutely.
You know, this is a shameless plug because we did a series called the Common Thread series, and we actually talked about this. It's in the second episode of an 8-part series that we did as we were going through the land of Israel. And one of the things that struck me when I was doing my study for the Common Thread series was that Moses might have not made it into the land in Deuteronomy chapter 34. He might have stopped just short of it. But God, in his kindness, because it almost seems really mean of God not to let him in, God, in his kindness, actually does bring Moses into the land. And I want to read that really quick because in Matthew chapter 17, at the Transfiguration, there are the 3 disciples, Peter, James, and John, with Jesus. And in Matthew chapter 17, it said, after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brothers of James, and led them up to a high mountain by themselves. And there he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as light. And just there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking to Jesus. So Moses maybe didn't make it into the promised land, into Israel in Deuteronomy 34, but in Christ, he did make it into the promised land. In Christ, the promises that were made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and to Moses do find their reality. Despite the mistakes of Moses, despite what happened, God still brought him into the land. And we see that right here in Matthew chapter 17.
That's really beautiful. And we'll make sure you have access in the description to the common threads if you want to take advantage of that and purchase a copy. Thank you so much, Chris. This was really beneficial.
Awesome.